One of the most difficult conversations we can have with our kids is about death. And today, here on the Coffee and Kidlit Show, I welcome author Eric Novak to talk about his book, Making All Things New, which really helps to make that whole conversation about death a lot easier and gentler. So, Eric, welcome to the show. I'm glad to have you here.
Hey, I'm so glad to be on and get to talk with you and, talk about this important topic with, death and dying and making all things new.
Yeah, it really is a beautiful book. I forget who's the illustrator again.
It's Carolyn Frank is the illustrator, and she really added such a beautiful touch to the book. I can't wait to talk more about her a little bit later in the show.
Yeah, yeah, we're going to be talking about how you found Carolyn and how that whole conversation went a little bit later. But first of all, just kind of introduce yourself to us. And I know you work for Every Woman a Theologian. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, that's correct. So I'm the
Okay.
creative director for Every Woman a Theologian. And that company is kind of interesting because they just have a really big heart for sharing the gospel, learning theology, teaching theology. And it's a really cool mission statement to, show up to work every single day. And that's what I work on. One of our sub brands is Faithful Kids, and Faithful Kids is the publisher of this book. And Faithful Kids just exists for the kind of the same reason, to teach people about Jesus and teach kids about Jesus. And I think what we've done differently than some other companies is start to get into these hard topics, right? Topics that aren't typically published, and topics that are maybe a little bit more practical for parents for some of the conversations that they have. So I have been in marketing for the past 15 years, and I've been a writer, since I was a teenager and blogging first started. I was one of the first kids up there on the internet writing about stuff that didn't matter. Um,
Yeah.
but now I guess it really surprised me. I have three kids of my own. I've got a 9-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 3-year-old. And I'm like, hey, like, I'm creating resources for the kids, my kids, that my kids need, and things that other parents just, really could use a hand.
Yeah, that's really cool. And we were talking before we went live that you're in South Carolina, not too far from where I'm from, and
That's right.
so very familiar with the area down there. And so that's really great. So this Faithful Kids, is that are they open to submissions, or is it more like an internal
Yeah.
publishing platform for the ministry, or how does that work?
So we have talked about publishing other authors, and we actually have, I think, currently published maybe four different authors. Um, I would definitely welcome people to send in submissions, because you never know, what we'll pick up. But I would say it's definitely more prone to like a topical conversation rather than just like a abstract kids book. So if your book is specifically teaching something, or if it's really honed in on a specific concept, I think that's going to have a lot bigger chance of getting published than just a book, about maybe fairies or something like that. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, we've published, now we've published a book on adoption. We've published a book on what is it? Just basically how God forms you, in the womb from the beginning. God knows you. God knows who you are, and it really
Yeah.
goes through the stages of like embryonic development all the way up until birth. And it's just a really easy way to teach kids about that concept. And then we've actually got another book that's coming out in a couple days here on the 16th. That's called Good News is Coming, and it's a bilingual lingual book. So it's English and Spanish, and that book is very interesting. It's called Good News is Coming, and it's just a picture of the gospel and kids getting to see the gospel. I've also published two other books with Faithful Kids. One of those is a book called Tiny Liturgies, and it just goes through these short little snippets of liturgies for kids, basically looking over items like, when you outgrow your shoes, just really looking at the spiritual significance on some of these really small things with kids. And then another book just on the Christology, looking at the echoes of Jesus early in the Bible through the patriarchs like Abraham and David and Saul, and really looking at how they're a foreshadowing of Jesus in the New Testament. So some of those books I think that are more oriented towards a specific topic might end up having a bigger chance to be published. But I'm going to share my Instagram later on. And if you contact me on Instagram, I will always look at all submissions and bring them up to our board.
That sounds really great. And I know I'm sure you're looking for more faith-based Christian authors. Do they have to necessarily be Christian books, or can they just kind of be written from a Christian worldview? It sounds like you've done some adoption books and things like that. What do you say about that?
Yeah, so I think our audience specifically is looking for books that are a topic that's based from a Christian perspective. So adoption was really based on, that book was really based on how does God see my adoption, and how does God see my family unit. And so most of those books, I think, I'm a really big fan personally of seeing stories that are from a Christian perspective, but aren't necessarily about a Christian subject. But this specific platform, Faithful Kids, I think is more oriented towards really pushing those important concepts that kids are trying to learn in faith. So that's where we're looking for books in that regards.
It's really valuable, really valuable. Glad you guys are doing that. So Making All Things New, when was that published?
It was published right on the tail end of COVID. So it was kind of, a timely book, and it was really based out of that impetus, and out of that time of kids just struggling with what's going on. I don't understand. I don't understand where grandpa is, that's really when that book got off the ground, and when I started writing it and getting it published. So,
well, just give us a quick summary of the book. Tell us what it's all about.
Yeah, so Making All Things New is kind of just a really brief overview of the concept of death and dying that you can take your kids through. It kind of follows the story of some animals making an autumn feast, and that's kind of where the internal of the book goes. But other than that, it really just shows how is Jesus involved in death and dying. And I didn't want to go like super heavy. This is a book probably for like 3 to maybe like 8 or 9. So I didn't want to go like super deep, but I wanted to give just an explanation that parents could use. So in that regards, like it's a tertiary overlook or tertiary overview, but it's something that I think can start a deeper conversation with your kids and start answering some of those questions that they
have. I noticed that you've got the book on the website for the ministry you're in, and you're not selling on Amazon at this point. Is that right?
No, we don't syndicate to Amazon at this point. A lot of our sales go directly through the website. So if you do want to buy it, it's on Felicia Masonheimer's website, and I'm sure we can put like a link down in the show notes or something like that. But that's it's funny because this conversation is like equally author perspective of like, why did you write the book, and then also author perspective of like, how did you write the book and how does that function. Amazon is such a great tool for self-publishers, right? And we all know that. If you can get your book on there and it makes sense to sell it on there, like that's great. For our platform, it's more based on the audience that's built around every woman a theologian. So we have a little bit of our built-in like people who are really invested in these books, and so that's why we're like, what would it make sense for Amazon? Yeah, maybe, maybe not. But I don't know. We've been talking about it, so maybe it will be on there someday. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's really great. And if you've got the platform, if you've got the audience to sell it, sort of locally, not locally, but on your own direct website, and able to, get it into the hands of those that you want to, I think that's great. Amazon doesn't have to be the platform for everyone. So yeah.
And we're
So
talking like
give us. Go ahead.
these are micro published books. I think to date, like this book might have sold just over maybe 1,000 copies. So it's not, I don't have a massive platform, but I do hope that this gets into the hands of parents who need it, right? And that's
Mhm.
something that, like in marketing, I push as much as I can, and then we let God get it out to whoever needs to see it.
Absolutely. And I'm guessing you have some local events, conferences, and things like that that you're able to kind of promote it to as well.
Yeah, and we're uh, Faithful Kids is very based off of just the platform around Every Woman a Theologian. So we have a really solid email list. We have a really solid Instagram following, and those numbers really rotate in getting the book out to people. And then also in Michigan in October, we usually have a conference up there, Verity Conference, and that conference can reach up to 2,000 people. So it tends to be a really great place for us to share our books.
Well, I know you mentioned that this is not your first book. You've done one or two others. What
Mhm.
sort of got you into writing books, children's books in general? What inspires you to do that?
Having kids is such a great inspiration for doing anything. You're like, wait, I need a resource. Like, am I gonna like create that myself? Where do I find it? Um, so there's been a couple books that I'm working on that are just adult books, but those are such a huge investment just in time and in resources. And some of the concepts, I'm like, man, this is just something like I need to share with my kids. So
Mhm.
my first book was that book, Where is Jesus? And it really goes through, like, if you look at the concept of David, traditional evangelical culture would tell you, you are David, and you need to slay your giants, and you need to go out there and you need to be big and strong enough with the power of God to wave that sling and knock your giants down. And I'm not saying that that's totally incorrect, but it is in a large part missing the point of David is a picture of Jesus the King, and Jesus the King comes to free his people from sin and death, and Jesus the King is a better David who doesn't sin, a better David who doesn't break God's laws, and really a better David who redeems mankind, right? So I wanted to go through the patriarchs and just really show, okay, from Adam all the way to Jesus, there is no perfect person in the Bible except for Jesus, and that really is the point of the Bible. So when I start coming up with these concepts, I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is something I need to share with my kids. I don't have any resources for this. I'm just gonna have to write it myself. That's really where I come from with my inspiration for writing.
That's a really interesting concept to be working on a sort of a nonfiction book for adults and then adapt it in
Mhm.
small bites for kids and explain it in a way that they can understand. I think that's really gold for any authors that might be
Oh yeah.
watching this. If you're writing, those larger books, and I'm doing something similar right now, and so to break it up into smaller bits for children
Yeah.
is really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, taking those concepts, those really big concepts, and you're like, how do I actually communicate this. There's somebody who's talked about different tiers of writing style specifically for adults. And there's kind of just like a base, like layperson, especially this is in theological writing specifically. Base layperson doesn't have a lot of theological education, doesn't really understand the terms. Like that's your base level. Then there's a little bit higher up. There's just a little bit more. They know a little bit more. Maybe this is like an elder, or maybe not a pastor, but definitely people who are more involved in theology in your church. They need a little bit more in-depth information. And then there's lay people, or then there's actual like pastors who are really, they should be really theologically astute, understand the terms. And then there's like theologians or people who are like in higher education, and that writing is just on a totally different level, thesis style writing. But all the way at the beginning, before that, is kids who need this information broken down on a second, third, fourth grade level and really need it disseminated to them. As you're looking at your writing and you're looking at where you fall on kind of that scale, who are you writing to? Academics almost owe it to lay people to break their writing down into easier to comprehend and understand writing, because they really need to disseminate that information from the top brainy nerds all the way down to the people who are just like, I don't know, what is penal substitutionary atonement? Like, I don't know what that is. So what is transubstantiation? I don't know what that is. So you really have to break those terms down and like, okay, take it down, take it all the way down to the kids so that they can understand these concepts too. I would love to write a book about like taking communion for kids. And I went into some of these books that are like, oh my gosh, like I can hardly read this book because it's just so nerdy. It's so like every single argument for every single contingency. And it's just like, okay, how do I break this down into terms for my 6-year-old that he would understand? How do I break this down in terms for my 3-year-old that he would understand?
Right. Yeah. So going back to this specific book, Making All Things New, what sort of inspired this one? Did it come out of something you're working on now, or was it something else?
This one was just really based out of, I think, COVID and everybody just really struggling with this concept societally of like, how do we explain this to kids? I dedicated this book to my grandpa, but he actually passed away long before COVID. He passed away when he was 97. And it says, dedicated to Grandpa John, thumbs up to God. He would always do this thing. He would go, thumbs up to God. He's like 97. It was like hardly coherent. Like, okay, Grandpa.
That's cool.
Yeah. He would also go, it's coming from the throne room to the dome room. I'm like, oh my gosh, my grandpa's like so senile, but he was precious. He was great. But yeah, like just like this was a hard concept. This is a hard concept, and there have been a couple times where I've heard back from people. Actually, at our conference last year in 2022, there was just a lady who was standing in line to buy some books, and I got a chance to, excuse me, I got a chance to talk to her, and I found out that her grandpa had died, and so I ran and I got the book. I gave it to her for free. I was like, you can, read this to your kids. And this year she was at the conference again, and she came up and she said, this was really what my kids needed, just to be able to understand what was going on. And I think we'll get into a little bit of the content of the book and a couple of the questions that you have. But yeah, it was just timely, I think.
I want to go ahead and dive in to part of the book. Now, this is not the introduction. This is actually a couple of spreads in, but this one page really struck me. And so I just wanted to read this quote from the book. You know how in the morning when the sun peeks through the curtains and mommy or daddy pulls them back to let in the light? That's what death is like. I thought that was a really profound image, and I just wanted to kind
Hmm.
of get your take on it, where that idea came from.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different places where that comes from, but I think just thinking about the separation of life and death. I think uh, Tim Keller might have been the one who said, um, dying is waking up to the better reality of life. And it's just like this idea that you die, but that's not the finality, that's not the end. Christians celebrate the undoing of death, right? And so Jesus is really flipping death on its head to say, no, this is not the end. This is just the beginning.
Mm.
Tolkien also said something. He said, um, everything sad is becoming untrue. And that is like just in the same vein of, you know, pulling back the curtain, the light comes in the window. The reality is that life is the bad dream. You're now waking up to the reality of Jesus and eternal glory and being in his presence and understanding, who you are in God. Um, I think that image also really, when we're looking at these topics, when we're looking at a topic like death, it's really easy to go to a kid and say, "Oh yeah, like grandpa's with Jesus, like that's fine," and like that is not enough for a kid to really understand. Okay, well, why is grandpa with Jesus? Where is Jesus? What does it mean that grandpa is with Jesus? Is that supposed to make me feel better because grandpa's not here anymore? But there's a
Mm.
reality that's always deeper than what's going on presently. And there's a really good book. This is Every Moment Holy by Douglas McKelvey, and this is just a book of kind of prayers. They call them liturgies, but there's this one specifically. Um, this is called "For Feasting with Friends," and just like it says here, so in celebrating this feast, we declare that evil and death, suffering and loss, sorrow and tears will not have the final word. And it goes on. It's a very long liturgy, but like when you get together this Thanksgiving, when you get together with your family and friends, like, are you just sitting down to eat a meal and say that you're thankful, or are you actually really celebrating the reality of a risen king who's making all things new, and you are proof with your family sitting down together that death doesn't have the final word, that you are celebrating the reality of not yet, but someday Jesus will come back and he'll make it all things new. I think these are the deeper conversations that are behind things that we need to actually look into to have, because that's where the real work happens. It's not just grandpa's with Jesus. This is the reason why. This is how we talk about this. So,
I think that is so powerful, and it's so easy to kind of get caught up into how long this life is. It feels almost like an eternity to some of us, but yet, like you
yeah,
said, I mean, you can't even say that this is the beginning. It's more like before the curtain call, so to speak. It's like before the life actually begins. I mean, it,
yeah,
like you said, it's not just the end; it's the beginning when we reach death, because that really is the start of eternity for us.
yeah,
Um, yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful thought, and this whole concept of making all things new comes from Revelation 21, and I just wanted to read this
yeah,
21 verses 4 to 5. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning or nor crying nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. Uh, Beautiful, amazing verses there. And to think that this is at the end of the Bible, um, it's kind of like that final statement, you might as well say.
Yeah.
God is making all things new, and this is really just the beginning. Let me get your thoughts on those verses and how much it means to you.
Well, it's interesting because if we view the Bible as a story that has specific acts, that has specific content that goes from point A to point B, there's definitely a crescendo. Um, this is the bookends. These are the bookends, right? You have Genesis, where God makes a beautiful garden, and you have
Hmm.
all this drama that happens, really, and then it sums up with the death of Jesus. And so this is the final word. Revelation is the final word, and it's sad that Revelation gets such a bad rap as a like prophecy book where there's a lot of fear tied into it instead of an assurance book of this is already what's happening. This is already God's plan in action. This is already God's final say. So you have Eden here and you have Revelation here, and that is really the closing of the book. And what's interesting too about this specific passage in Revelation is there's two parts in Revelation that, man, I really love. One is where we have John, and he's saying he's so upset because there's nobody to open the scroll, and he's like, who's gonna read it? Like, he's having this amazing vision, and all of a sudden he's like, who's gonna open the scroll? Oh no, it's like there's nobody to open the scroll, and Jesus opens the scroll.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh my gosh, this is like the best thing that could have happened. Jesus is there to open the scroll. And so then we talk about here, what does it mean that God comes to dwell with mankind, right? You've got goosebumps. I've got goosebumps. Like, this is the crescendo. This is the final coming together of the Bible, um, and God's message for mankind. But really, this is now talking about when God dwells with mankind. We have, our present reality on earth, and then we die and we go and we essentially wait for God to resurrect us. God resurrects us, and then we live with God in a new eternity. On earth, essentially, but it's a new heaven and it's a new earth. And it says even that there's no need for the sun because the glory of God is encompassing the city, the New Jerusalem, and he's there, and he is the sun because his glory is physically shining so bright. It's amazing. So this verse here is just saying, like, everything is being made new. Everything is returning to Eden. Everything is going back to God's original intent, God's original design. And if you really look at your suffering and your pain through the gospel, Jesus is with you during those times. I mean, as adults, like when we try to explain these things to kids, it's I think it's really sometimes also a reality for us that we have to look inside and say, oh, how does this play out for us as adults? This book, you know, this book makes me cry because this is the reality of what Jesus does when he's making all things new. And so when we're kind of looking at these concepts and we're like, what does it mean for Jesus to be in my suffering with me? When he's making all things new, it's not to say those things didn't matter, but it's saying those things will all be set right. Those things will all be returned to their original purpose and intent. All creation, everything that's broken will be mended through Jesus and through God. So I love Revelation. I think it's such a great book as just a summary of everything. It's like, this is the end, but oh my gosh, it's just the beginning. It's crazy.
I was just thinking that Death can be a scary thing and it can be a difficult thing to talk about with kids. But as Christians, it's just really hitting me that it shouldn't be that way.
Right.
That it should be a really beautiful discussion because, like you said, this is just the beginning. And so, to I've always been wrapped up into being afraid of when my loved ones die. You know, um, but really we should celebrate that. If
Yeah.
as believers, if they are Christians, we can celebrate that because they are entering the rest of their life. I mean, not even the rest of their life isn't even the right way to say it, but um, it's just really amazing to think about. And I think about the
Yeah.
phrase celebration of life. A lot of people use that for funerals, but it goes even beyond that because it's not a celebration of this physical life, but it's a celebration of entering their real life as we will know it in
Yeah.
eternity with Jesus. Um, and that really is something to celebrate.
Oh yeah. Yeah. That's
Wow.
true. And I was talking about my grandpa, and there's a difference too between my grandpa who was 97. He must have had 9 lives because he was in the Air Force in World War II and made out of that. He in his 70s he fell backwards off of a ladder and had like a subdermal hematoma where they had to release the pressure off of his brain. So this guy has just
Wow.
like lived many lives. He was a band director and piano tuner after that, and just crazy. But when Grandpa passed away, like there was no part of me that could be sad in like the sense of like, man, I really miss Grandpa because Grandpa loved Jesus. Grandpa was ready to go see Jesus. He was done. He had been here for a really long time. He had lived
Mhm.
closer in terms to the Civil War than our present time. It's just crazy to think of like this age that he spanned. Um,
Yeah.
but at the same time, that's very different than my wife's mom. My mother-in-law just passed away at the age of 50 from breast cancer, and how do we approach death and dying for somebody who is 50 versus somebody who is 100? Those
Mhm.
are very different things to struggle with. But we do have the assurance that people who die who love Jesus are ushered into a beautiful reality, just so much
Mhm.
better reality. Even people who are struggling with cancer, the pain and debilitating nature of cancer and chemotherapy, they're ushered into a much better place, and we miss them terribly. There's a lot of pain and sadness, and I think you're right to say, man, like I can't imagine, and it sucks, and it's so hard to imagine reality without your loved one. But at the
Mhm.
same time, what does it mean? Where did they go? There's a little bit of a balm there in death and it not having the final word. That's Christians. That's the reality. Death does not have the final word.
And
Jesus
and I think,
Jesus said that. Jesus turned death on its
yeah.
head. That is a huge main tenet of the gospel. So
And right. And I think that phrase making all things new makes a lot more sense when you have someone who is dying uh, much too young
yeah.
because of cancer or something like that, because they are being made completely new
Hmm.
without the cancer and without the illness or whatever it may be. So that's really amazing. So, but we want to get into a little bit more of the publishing topic. But first of
Okay,
all, do
cool.
you have any final words for parents on talking to kids about death?
Kids are really smart. I think just really being willing to not put the conversation on the back burner as like, oh, like maybe they won't understand, or maybe this is too mature of a topic. Kids do want to know, and um, they want to be reassured that I think they're not about to die. They want to understand, where did this person go, and they want to really start to try to wrap their minds around and grapple with this. And I you know there's a lot of different people who have said death was really like the catalyst as a kid for their maturing into an adult. Like the first time you start to grapple with um, mortality, and like, oh, like I'm not infinite. Like I don't just exist forever. For my kids, we had a pet dog that was a beautiful little golden doodle, and he got out from underneath the fence and got hit on the road, and like, oh, the dog is not coming back, the dog is gone, where did the dog go? That's kind of their first grappling with, there was a finite end to this beautiful creation, and where did it go? It's broken. So I think really just not being afraid to start grappling with and talking with those things, because kids will figure it out, and if they don't figure it out from you, they're going to figure it out down the road, and they're going to have those questions internally, and you're their safe place to really talk about these things and start grappling with them. I think this book is a good place, because it's just deep enough to say, like, oh, okay, how can we start talking about this? And I do have some notes in the back for parents, just saying, hey, this is how you can go deeper on this, and you can start talking to your kids a little bit more.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, yeah, that's really great. I encourage anyone to get the book and read those notes in the back and use this book. And I do have the link down in the description to purchase the book for anyone who is interested. But let's talk about finding your illustrator. Now, I know this is not
yeah.
the only book that Faithful Kids has with this illustrator. Was this wasn't the first book either, was it?
No, and so when I first started looking for illustrators, man, like illustration, I think is the main challenge, because most people are working on a really constricting budget. They're like, hey, I don't have a massive amount of money to push out into illustration. I just really, and then if you're self-publishing on top of that, then you have publishing costs and your book materials and your book binding and your printing. And that's just like, wow, there's a lot in there.
Yeah.
Most books, if you're printing like a run of 500 books, like you're looking at maybe a cost of $2,000 to $3,000 for those books. So you're like, where does my illustration budget really fit in there? So you're trying to kind of gauge who you can afford, right? And so I've gone through lists and lists of illustrators, so many different illustrators, to see, where do you guys fall? And I've had quotes from $30,000 to do a book, all the way down to $500 to do a book. Carolyn, I and I almost really I kind of hate that I use this platform, because I think most of the time the platform's not great. But I used Fiverr to find Carolyn, and when I did go through different quotes and I looked and I saw, hey, these are all the different options out there. What I saw with her is she's a Canadian illustrator. She charges a fair price for her illustration, but she's really looking for, how can I make a living off of this? Not how can I just have one book that I do, that I really dedicate myself to that art, and then like that's my project for like half a year or something. Some
Mhm.
illustrators really are like, when you look at a $30,000 book project, and they're like, hey, I'm gonna do 8 illustrations. They're slating that out as a commitment for 6 months, that every month they're just going to be methodically working through one beautiful illustration. um, and it's crazy, because like some of the illustrators are worth it, that's what they're worth. But they're looking at syndication on a much bigger level than a micro publisher or a self publisher. So
Right.
Carolyn was super affordable. I found her on Fiverr, and she was really looking for, looking for more consistent work. So I had her illustrate a couple different books, and it's also interesting because she's not a Christian. So as I've talked with her, I'm like, hey, are you comfortable with designing this, illustrating this book? That's on a very, very Christian subject. And she reads through these manuscripts and she's like, yes, I'm comfortable, or no, I'm not comfortable. She declined, a couple books that were maybe more specifically towards like the pro-life side of things. And that's okay. I don't want to force anybody to do art for something that they can't support as a secular person. But
Yeah.
at the same time, she's dealing with these issues of like death and dying from a Christian perspective. So I just love that we're working together in that context. And her grandpa just passed away, so I'm like, hey, I hope you appreciated that book. I hope that there's something that you can learn from that, or maybe take from that. So yeah,
Mm.
Fiverr, honestly, probably not the best platform, but try to use it ethically and try to make sure people are getting, valued for the work that they're doing, and that it fits a good budget, but isn't something that you're, trying to rip off like a Bangladeshi person who's like illustrating your book for $5 a day. Obviously, it's not going to be $5, but I think if you fool around on there, find the right people, you can get a good illustrator.
Yeah, I would normally discourage, as a book
Yeah,
designer, I discourage my authors from hiring illustrators on Fiverr because
yeah,
typically the ones you find on there, they're using a lot of stock imagery, or they
mm,
could be taking your illustrations and using them for other books as well. And so they're
true.
looking for ways to kind of multiply what they've already done and to maximize, and earn as
Oh
much money
yeah,
as they can off of each piece. And but the interesting thing about Carolyn's work is it's all by hand, it's not digital.
it is. Yeah,
um, so there's I wouldn't think there is much way for her to do that. And so you really have
right.
found someone on Fiverr that can create something that's original for your book, at a good price, that's fair for
Yeah,
you, fair for her. And I think that's, fantastic. That's really great.
yeah.
So
It's
that's
crazy because there's so much different technology. There's so many different platforms that you can look at, so many different places that you can find illustrators. But really saying, yeah, oh my gosh, like we've got to have a really good quality. Uh, I think that this turned out beautiful. Obviously, she's a really talented, watercolor artist. Um, she
yeah.
kind of ran me through just a process of like, here's the general illustrations, here's the rough drafts, and then we kind of went from there to create more finalized pieces.
And as I'm scrolling through the pages here, and I don't want to show too much of the book. Um,
That's a short book.
but
It is.
yeah, uh, one thing that I wanted to bring up with you, and this was one of the questions that I presented to you early on, was that the book really follows two stories. You
Mm,
have the text, which is very much about death and the new life that we have through Christ, and then you have this other story that is presented by the illustrations, which are not a direct connection with the
yeah,
story. It's these animals, anthropomorphic animals that are all preparing for a big feast, and
yeah,
that's really all it is. But
yeah,
the two tie in so well together. It's really a beautiful connection there that a lot of people won't get, but we as Christians, it makes sense. Where did this concept come from? Was it yours that you presented to Carolyn, or was it a conversation? How did this happen?
yeah. Yeah, so I think it's just very similar to, even the concept is very similar to even what we are talking about with Every Moment Holy, where the feast is a deeper reality of what's happening, right? And in Revelation, it goes on to talk about the wedding feast of the Lamb, where
Yeah.
people are just gathered around, feasting, enjoying the goodness of God, right? And so what I was illustrating, what I told Carolyn is, I don't know if you have ever heard of the Redwall series by Brian Jakes. Very big fictional series, and it's essentially anthropomorphized animals that live in Redwall Abbey, and it's kind of like a medieval tone teenage fiction series, and it's like, gosh, he wrote like 12 books before he passed away, but they're thick, like meaty books. And all the animals live in like an abbey, and they all like have these giant medieval battles and stuff. And the mice are good, but then like the weasels are bad, and the badgers are good, but then like the stoats and the vermin and the rats are bad. And so it's just a very like interesting concept. But when she had read those books, and I knew she had in her head an idea of kind of what that looked like. And so I said, yeah, really, like, let's bring out this idea of these animals who are living together, and they're just preparing for the feast. They're getting ready to enjoy this meal together. They're preparing the food. They're making pies and dishes and things like that. And they're just getting ready to feast and enjoy life together. And she really got that idea and was able to communicate it in illustrations, which they have to go hand in hand. Like, man, if the illustrations don't match the text, like every author is terrified of what if the illustrations don't go well. And I think they mesh. I think they really did really well.
Yeah, I agree, and it's just an interesting concept to see sort of this two stories kind of happening at the same time. I think
Yeah.
that's just really creative and a great way to do it. And with what can be a difficult conversation, it really lightens the whole mood and makes it fun for kids to see all these animals making this huge feast. It's just fun.
It's funny. My mom worked in traditional publishing at David C. Cook during like the 80s, I think. And they had this rule where you could not create biblical concepts with animals. And I don't know why or where that came from, but it really boxed in like a lot of conversations, because it's like, how do we communicate this in a fun way? Well, animals are really expressive. Kids love animals. Like, how do we do this? And I just remember my mom saying, like, oh my gosh, it made assignments so hard, because she was illustrating and she was creating these things. And she's like, we just can't like do anything with animals at all. It's just like weird. Christian publishing. I don't know why, but okay, fine. Kind of strange.
Yeah. So, Eric, do you have any final advice for first-time authors who might be looking for illustrators or trying to communicate with their illustrators?
Yeah. Find somebody that you really mesh with. Save up if you need to. But you can also usually go to an illustrator and get a rough done, or just like some concept work done for very, very cheap. I've had concepts done by really, really good artists for under $100, that maybe I didn't work with that artist down the road, but it at least gave me a place to start imagining my book from the perspective of illustration. Especially with kids' books, sometimes the text ends up being a little bit shorter. And so you're like, the illustration really needs to fill these gaps, and it really needs to flesh out the book. So just kind of being okay with taking it slow, working with different illustrators, but also really looking for quality, really looking for something that's above the normal standard. I think is really a slow, healthy process for an author. Also, when you're talking to like micro publishers like Faithful Kids, if you don't have an illustrator, sometimes that's okay. Sometimes we'll provide an illustrator for you. Might be Carolyn. It might be one of our other illustrators. that we work with really regularly. So there's a lot of different options too to say, where do I go from here? How do I get somebody to make this project come to life? Because some of these concepts are like, man, I read some concepts and I'm like, I just have to make this a reality. We were sent a manuscript last week, and it came into my email, and I just replied to my boss. I was like, "We have to do this." Like, it was just they just sent the text in a Word document, and it was like not even edited or anything. And I was like, "We're publishing that. We have to make it a reality. It's the concept has to be out there for kids. It's so good."
Yeah.
So yeah, work with your illustrators if that's where you're going, but also don't be afraid to have that be more of a conversation and not just like this is like I got to get an illustrator right now, got to shell out $5,000 or wherever you're going.
Yeah, and just to support what you said about sort of those beginning developmental stages, you might hire an illustrator to do the character development if your story is based on a specific character and you really want to flesh that out. Hire an
Yeah,
illustrator or a couple of illustrators to sort of work on what that character might look like and include different emotions and things like that. And I would say in your case with this specific book, just as an example, you might have an illustrator develop a few different environment
yeah,
styles or looks or what have you. So there's a few different ways that you can approach it, and I think it's definitely helpful to just like you said, pay them some to do some of that
yeah,
developmental work before you sign the contract and say, yes, I'm going to move forward with you. Just gives you a
for
much
sure.
better picture of what that could look
A
like.
lot of
And
illustrators
it
will
kind of
do that
helps you
too.
with the
Yeah.
whole conversation, what the conversation will look like as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, a lot of illustrators will sit down and do some basic work for a really affordable price just to give you samples of what they can
Yeah.
create. And I love seeing that stuff. I love when it comes back to my desk and I'm like, oh, okay, this is what I wrote. This matches. This is gonna work. It's great. It's very cool to see.
Yeah, it really brings it to life too, because
Mhm.
it's hard to picture what a character might look like, but once they start putting the words to a face, it really
Yeah,
makes a difference. And I just want to say, do not ask illustrators to do that for free. Like I said, there has to be a price tag behind it. Pay them for the work.
especially, hey,
Uh,
you're a Christian. The worker is worthy of his wage. That's a pretty good Christian concept as well. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we end today's discussion, I just want to invite anyone who's watching who might be an author, maybe you're working on your first book, go to my website, launchmissioncreative.com/roadmap, and download my free author roadmap. It'll walk you through the three essential questions that I think you need to answer before you even hire that illustrator. So I think that was just a great place to
awesome.
kind of make that shameless plug for my roadmap. Hop in there and get that. But Eric, tell us what's next. Do you have
Mm.
any sneak peeks, anything you're working on that you can share with us?
Yeah. So I do have this year. I wanted to come out 2024. I wanted to come out with my second book on tiny liturgies, and just as we talked about in Every Moment Holy, with the liturgy based on um, feasting with friends. There's a couple other ones here, just like a ritual for morning coffee, where you're just talking through, like, oh, in this moment, how do I focus my heart on Jesus? I want to come up with some more, and honestly, there's so many things with my kids that I go, there's a deeper connection here,
Yeah.
and so I want to come out with volume two on that. There's a couple other projects that I'm working on too, but that's going to be, I think, the one that I'm like pushing to get done in 2024. And people really enjoy those, especially with the fleeting moments with your little kids. Do you have kids?
I do. I have two kids, Aiden and Esther. Aiden is 8 years
Okay.
old. Esther's 5. Esther was actually the inspiration behind my first book, which she was born deaf, and she has cochlear
Okay.
implants. So,
Yeah.
I really try to kind of advocate for the deaf community and sign language and
That's so cool.
hearing devices and stuff like that. So,
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome.
yeah,
So, just the fleeting nature of childhood,
yeah.
especially at, I think, 5 years old, you're just kind of out of those toddler years, and you're like, you're like, you're a new
Mhm.
thing. Like, I don't understand how this works. Um, but
Exactly.
it's like,
Still
yeah,
figuring
I'm
it out.
right, yeah. But I'm like with my 3-year-old, I'm like, man, there's so many moments that are just like, this is the end of the baby years. This is the end of the toddler years. So I really appreciate those, and I think some of those tiny liturgies are written as much for the kids as they are for me to just remember, like, when a crayon breaks, this is a crisis of great proportions to somebody whose entire world is based around the crayon. And for me as an adult, there's 100 other crayons, but for a 3-year-old, that is the world crumbling.
Yeah.
And so some of those things are just like, I need to slow down, focus on my child, focus on what they're feeling in that moment, and how that relates to the gospel and how Jesus meets them in their sadness for a broken crayon. So, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Eric, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. I think you brought a lot of value to this show and the conversation that we were able to have. I hope it really helps a lot of parents out there dealing with this conversation of death with their kids. How can viewers find you? How can they reach out to you?
well, we can drop a link in the show notes for Instagram, for my Instagram, Eric R. Novak. And you can find me there. That's where I post all of my updates on books and things like that. And I have links to purchase those books as well. So,
Yeah,
yeah, you can find me there.
that sounds good. Well, I want to invite everyone to come join me again in 2 weeks with MJ Slate, who is the author of What Does the U.S. Constitution Say? She has a whole series of patriotic topic books. And so I'm really
There you go.
excited to talk to MJ Slate about
My
that
kids could
here in a couple of
probably use
weeks.
those too.
Yes, absolutely. It's a good educational topic, and kind of moves away from the more fictional style book, and much like yours, actually it's a nonfiction style book, but just in a different genre completely. So but that'll be interesting. But again, Eric, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much. You take care.
All right, everyone, we please come back again in 2 weeks, and in the meantime, go write the book. See ya.